Hi, Sam Baxendale here, co-founder of Kinetik Hiring. So in today's Insight on Demand, we're going to talk about the topic of wellness. Now, in a research paper recently published by the Journal of Organizational Behavior, it was identified there are a host of massive benefits associated with having an effective wellness program in your business. Not only can it improve the bottom line through improving productivity, through staff engagement and enhancing staff communication, it can also help to reduce costs associated with absenteeism and things like insurance premiums. Obviously, in the post-COVID world in which we live, we've heard the word wellness an awful lot, and improvements have been made. But still, there's work to be done here in Malaysia specifically. It's still not effectively defined. It's still not quite front and center within a lot of institutions here in Malaysia. And the timing just isn't right in terms of the wellness cycle, in terms of its implementation. So here to talk about this important topic is Joe Fisher.
Hi, Sam.
Hi, Joe, who is extremely passionate about the topic of wellness and an expert in the field. So, Joe, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Fantastic. So if you just like to start and tell everyone a bit about yourself, your background, and that would be great for everyone to hear.
Sure. So basically, I've worked in HR for over 20 years, primarily in the UK and in Malaysia. I came here for 1 year. I've now been here for 13. As Sam said, I am particularly interested in wellness or well-being. So hopefully we'll have a great discussion today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Joe. So to start, perhaps we could just spend a few minutes introducing wellness. If you could talk to us about why corporate wellness is so important.
Sure.
To any company, and perhaps how it might impact the bottom line as well. That would be
Sure.
great to hear.
So I think the first thing is, let's talk about what is corporate wellbeing. So I think we'll probably use the terms wellbeing and wellness interchangeably throughout our discussion today. But wellbeing basically looks at the ways in which work can impact on the health and happiness of employees. And I think because we actually spend so much of our time at work these days, employers are actually realizing how important it is that they actually make a positive impact on people, and that they can do that through work.
Yeah.
So what they're trying to do now is figure out how to make work an experience which actually enhances people's health and enhances their happiness overall.
Yeah.
And this obviously then has a knock-on effect to people's life outside of work as well.
Yeah.
So while the interventions that employers may put into place might not be specifically about things that are outside of work, they can have a knock-on positive effect to those things.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, I think employers are interested in well-being, number one, because they have a duty of care to their employees.
Yeah.
But I think also they realise that having happy and healthy employees really does have an effect on their bottom line. So happy, healthy people end up taking less sick days, which probably translates into lower insurance premiums, which means better productivity, better engagement, employees who stay in employment for longer. Yeah. And I think overall that gives a better perception of the brand, and that all then impacts on the bottom line.
Yeah.
And a lot of these things are actually measurable.
Yes.
So I guess that's really why employers are starting to become more and more interested in this topic.
Absolutely. So, could you help maybe dispel some of the myths around wellness? I think wellness is one of those topics we hear about. It might be deemed a bit of a corporate buzzword. Can you help to sort of rein in on what actually wellness is all about and address some of those misconceptions?
Yeah, so I think first of all, one thing I would say is when we talk about health, we're talking about not just people's physical health at work, we're talking also about their mental health. So I think in the past, there's been a lot of talk, and it's been really great, about physical well-being, and how people can get fitter, or how we help people manage when they have actually got diagnosable medical conditions. Yeah. But I think where, there's a massive gap is on the side of mental well-being and mental health. Yeah. So even in society now as a whole, talking about mental well-being and mental health is still very stigmatized. So you can imagine this is very difficult to talk about in a work context as well. Yeah. So that's what now when we think about well-being, we think about overall well-being, we definitely need to think about mental health as well. Yep.
Absolutely.
And I think the other thing is it's a full spectrum of kind of conditions and things that would affect people. So at the one end, on a physical and a mental basis, you have actual illnesses which are diagnosed by a doctor, which are treated, which people maybe need a lot of time off work for.
Yep.
But then we have things, on the physical side, like people just being fitter, moving more, eating better, sleeping better.
Yep.
And organizations want to have a good impact on that as well.
Yes.
And on the mental health side, it's things like how do you manage stress? How do you help people to cope better? How do you get better motivation? And generally make people feel happier about their jobs and happier about being at work.
Yep.
I think there's also a bit of a misconception that well-being might be a little bit out there, a little bit all about yoga and meditation. And sure, that's part of it, or it can be part of it, but that's one small part of an overall kind of comprehensive program, which I would probably talk a little bit more about a little bit later.
Okay, thanks, Jo.
So I think overall then, just to sum up, healthier and happier employees that's obviously great for individuals.
Yep.
And it's great for life outside of work as well. But it's also great for organisations because it does actually impact and help them improve their bottom lines and their perception in the marketplace as well.
Fantastic. So Jo, is it fair to say that there's no one size fits all when it comes to corporate wellness, and that any particular wellness program must be specific to a particular organisation's culture?
Yes, and that's a pretty simple answer, but I think anything that involves people has to be very specific to the audience and very specific to the organisation.
Yeah.
But I think having said that, when you're thinking about developing, a really comprehensive wellness or well-being program for your organisation, there is a very basic framework that organisations should think about and should look at.
Yeah.
And I think if I quickly run through that for you, then it will become clear. So there are three basic areas or broad areas that organisations should look at. The first thing that they should consider is what are the organisational or the work drivers of well-being? So what are the things about jobs or the things about organisations which actually impact people's well-being?
Yep.
Now, some examples of this are, first of all, work environment, and I'm thinking specifically now about offices. So do you have an environment which is actually fit for purpose? Can people have meetings? Are there areas where they can have quiet time? Is there somewhere they can have lunch? Do you have potentially standing desks so people can move about a little bit more? Do you have the proper equipment and chairs so that people, don't get back issues, for example?
Yep.
That would be one. Something else to consider is actual job design. Do people have meaningful work to do, and do they have a level of autonomy and control over the work that they do? So that's actually super important that that people have that in terms of their own happiness day to day at work. Communication. This kind of ties into security. So people really need to understand what's going on in the business. So is the business communicating, how it's doing, whether or not someone, has a job which is going to be secure and stable. And I think this has been super important during the recent pandemic.
Yep. Absolutely.
And organisations that have communicated well with their employees have probably found that those people have probably a bit better mental health than organisations that haven't.
Absolutely.
Feedback is also really, really important. So making sure people understand, what is my career path? Do I have a career path?
Yep.
Am I going to potentially be promoted? Am I going somewhere in this organisation? And do I know, what I'm doing well and maybe what I need to work on?
Yep.
I think connection also is super important. So like security, having connections is something which, really impacts on our mental health and our happiness.
Yes.
So being able to make friends and people, there's a lot of studies that talk about, being able to make friends at work.
Yeah.
So organizations need to provide people with ways to make formal and informal connections.
Yeah.
And then I think the final one in kind of like this area is around balance.
Yeah.
So what I'm talking about here is flexible working and work-life balance. And again, this is something I think which has really come up recently through COVID and the pandemic. So the second broad area to touch on, I think, is creating a culture of wellness.
Yep.
This one I think is actually quite difficult. So organisations really need to be very clear about what they mean when they talk about wellness and well-being and what good looks like. Individuals need to also feel that they can talk about this in the workplace. So they can talk about well-being, they can talk about happiness.
Yeah.
And also that when they're not feeling, that their health is that great or they're not feeling that happy, they know how to kind of raise that. They know who to talk to and who to go to.
And comfortable doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's also back to, has the organisation defined what wellness is?
Yeah.
Have they made it okay to talk about it?
Yeah.
I think another really important thing as well is that in some organizations, ones that do it well, they actually have ways for people to recognize when other people's health or happiness is actually going kind of like downwards, and they know how to escalate that. They know who to speak to. We're not expecting people to be psychiatrists or psychologists or trained professionals, but they recognize the signs. So I think it's also important then that you have mentors and coaches in that environment that people can actually go to.
Absolutely.
And I think by far the most important thing in creating a wellness culture or a well-being culture is to have senior leadership who actually advocate and who are actually involved in all of these things. So you have senior leaders who are talking about well-being, who are modeling the right behaviours. Because if you don't have that, it's going to be super difficult to create that culture.
Fantastic,
And then the final area is around programs and policies. So having policies like flexible working policy, maybe certain leave policies, having programs. So this is, I think, what people think about when they think about well-being, like the yoga program or the gym membership. That's a very, very small part of the overall comprehensive program. I think also in this kind of category, you look at things like employee wellbeing surveys and assessments, so that you're getting a constant temperature check of, you know, how people are feeling. And getting that feedback, and that can help guide your program as well.
Yes, of course.
And then I think giving people opportunities for self-development, maybe through volunteering work and everything else, again, that gives people a sense of kind of like holistic happiness and you know, just good well-being. So I think they're the kind of three broad areas that organisations need to think about. But when you're thinking about your own organisation and your own people, you have to think about how you tailor interventions in each of those areas to be specific to the culture that you have. So I'll give you an example. Sorry to interrupt, if you have a very traditional organisation, it might not be relevant to start talking to people about mindfulness as an example. You might want to talk instead, think about your audience, talk about awareness, which might be something which is more palatable to that group at that point in time. And you might not want to offer a program around yoga or meditation because it might not be something that people will be particularly interested in. You might want to talk to them about taking breaks or taking a half an hour to go walk their dog or spend time with their children, etc. So you definitely have to think about what is relevant to the people in your organisation.
Absolutely, entirely subjective. So just in summary then, to address wellness within your organisation, it's super important to make it subjective and to look at those three key pillars. So
the three pillars, just quickly again, just to reiterate that. The first one is, what are the organisational drivers of well-being? So these are the things that the organisation does, things relating to the actual job. Creating a culture of well-being, as I say, super important. And then programs and policies.
So Jo, switching the topic a little bit, could you tell us about the role of data in the process of evaluating a wellness program?
Sure. I think, Sam, that actually data is important in a number of ways. Before we actually even get to the evaluation phase of the actual program itself, I think we need to look at how we would actually use data to make a business case to actually implement and devise a wellness program. So I think within any organisation, you already have like a lot of information and data, and it's about how you kind of like harness that. So number one, if you have data around sick leave, data around productivity, also if you've done any kind of like employee opinion surveys, there will be questions which are relevant for wellbeing, so picking those out. So taking those metrics then and kind of looking at where you sit now as a baseline, and then thinking about how you're going to kind of move the needle on those things, and then assigning like a value, like a value, kind of like dollar value to that, will show how that will impact the bottom line. But obviously that will link to things like productivity. So if you're looking at sick leave data, improving that will should lead to a knock-on increase and improvement in the productivity data that you have as well.
Absolutely,
so presenting that. So that's number one. I think the second thing then also is, how do you use data to determine what your wellbeing program is going to look like and what your priorities are? So again, looking at data around employee opinion surveys, and if you haven't done that, you can always run a quick survey within the organisation. But figuring out, where are the gaps currently in your organisation? Which are the things that are making people feel, less happy at work, or things that are actually impacting people's mental health.
Absolutely.
And that will help you determine what your priorities are.
Yep.
So it will give you some quick wins, but it will also demonstrate to people that you have actually listened. You are actually doing something which is benefiting them, and which is in response to what they've told you.
Absolutely.
And then the third thing is obviously evaluating the program.
Yes.
So going back to the metrics that you pulled out at the very beginning to actually make the business case and monitoring those. So I think you have to figure out kind of the cadence of, frequency of how often that you're going to review those. Some of those may be a monthly thing, maybe some of them are quarterly.
Yep.
And then being able to present that data back. And I think that's like everything with HR. You need to be able to back up what you're doing with data.
Yep.
And, show the results through data.
Yep, that makes sense.
So super important, yes.
Absolutely. As a next question, I think some advice for businesses looking to roll out their wellness programs. I think a good starting point is to work out stakeholder engagement. Whose responsibility is it to identify and establish and roll out these programs? Is it HR, or is it the shared responsibility of the entire leadership team? Could you give us some guidance on that? Where does it start from?
Sure. I mean, I think where it starts from is not as important as what you do after that. So, I mean, it could start with HR. That's where the idea could come from.
Yeah.
But I think you absolutely 100% have to have leadership sponsorship.
Yes.
And when I say sponsorship, I don't mean just someone who's going to kind of like sign off on, the business case and say, yes, go ahead with that program. You need people who are on the leadership team who are going to be actively involved in the program.
Yes.
So I think I talked previously about creating a wellbeing culture and the importance of having leaders who are advocates for wellbeing and leaders who model the right behavior.
Yes.
You absolutely have to have that. Otherwise, this will not take off. And the reason I say that is partly because a lot of the things that are associated with wellbeing and mental health, as I say, are quite stigmatized.
Yes.
So, senior people have to be out there showing that it's okay to talk about this stuff.
Yep.
That it is something that people should care about.
Absolutely.
Number one. And I think the other important thing as well is to have employee advocates.
So look in your organisation and find, who are the kind of formal and informal opinion leaders within the organisation. Get those people on board, make them champions of your program.
Yes.
They will absolutely help you to get other people on board and, help get other people to participate.
Yes.
And I think if you can do that, then you've got a really kind of like holistic approach, which, should guarantee you or give you some level of success.
Yep. So it doesn't come from one corner, it's a 360 thing and everyone's should be engaged.
Exactly, and when you look at wellbeing, and when you look at the things that I talked about in the framework of the program, a lot of these things are, you kind of could look at them and kind of say, well, hold on, that's just good practice, or we're already doing that in HR. Like all these things are interlinked. So there is no kind of silo here. We're talking about people and we're talking about, overall how they feel about work and, what their contribution is and how that impacts the business.
Absolutely.
So, yes.
Absolutely. So Joe, let's look at some examples in the market that you've come across of wellness programs. Are there any particular examples of wellness programs that have been done particularly well that you'd like to comment on?
Okay, yeah, this is a really good question actually. And I think this kind of demonstrates the gap in the market right now. So when I kind of look at great examples, to me, the really, really good examples are the MNCs. So exactly as you'd expect, Google, Microsoft, they're doing it really, really well. But I think when I kind of look and I try to look at smaller organizations or, country-specific organizations, it's really hard to find great examples.
Yes.
Now, I think a bit of a misconception here is people might look at this and think, oh my God, we're not Google, we're not Microsoft, we don't have this much money. How on earth are we going to have a wellbeing program?
Yeah.
It's not about that. You don't have to have lots of money. So I think there are so many things that organizations can do and things they should start with. So thinking about, again, going back to the framework and thinking about the organizational drivers. So can you create a great work-life balance for people? Yes, you can. That doesn't cost you money to do that. Can you give people flexible working options? Again, yes, that doesn't cost money. And also think about the things that Microsoft and Google do that cost a lot of money. So maybe they have a gym or something on site, and that's fantastic, and it looks really cool and everything else. But kind of think about, if you had that in your organization, is that even relevant to you? Would that be even something that people would use?
Yes.
So I think we get a little bit caught up in some of these things, and again, back to the framework, we get caught up in the programs and things, and we don't think about all of the other things that we could be doing. Creating the right culture. Again, it doesn't cost money to do do that.
Yep.
So I think that's really the trick that people are maybe missing at the moment.
Absolutely. So thinking about maybe those more country-specific examples or wellness programs on a budget, are there any initiatives that you've seen that have been put into practice, however big or small, that you think, actually, that's really cool, that's really effective?
Yeah, I mean, there are small things. I mean, and I think particularly around COVID and things, a lot of organisations have been doing a lot of work. And again, a lot of this is around programs and things, but I think they're realising now that it has to go further than that. But just small things like, creating the right culture. So what I've heard is, people who have like these kind of like phone tree kind of situations where when people have worked from home, you have someone on a list and you call them and you make sure they're okay, and they call someone else and make sure they're okay.
Yes.
So it's creating the right culture.
Yes.
But it's also allowing connection.
Yes.
So you're constantly, checking in with people.
Yeah.
A lot of examples of people doing things on Zoom and, and even informally people in organisations have been doing that and getting together that way. So again, that need for connection.
So it's actually about being creative more than putting a lot of spend into it.
Exactly, and if a gym or something, if fitness is something which is really important to people within your culture and your environment, think about how you could go to a local gym and do some kind of deal, offer some kind of subsidy.
Yes.
Again, someone like Google, and I would love this, they have a great canteen and everything else where you can eat and everything else. Organisations can't afford to do that.
No, of course.
So again, just think about what facilities you might offer within your workplace for people to bring food and heat it up, people to be able to sit down and eat together, or maybe do a deal with a cafe as to, giving some kind of discount. So you just have to kind of think about what you can do that is relevant and that your employees would actually use and appreciate.
Absolutely, yep. So based on your observations, Joe, what do some businesses get wrong from your observations, let's say in the Malaysia market, when they're rolling out a wellness program?
Well, Sam, I think the first thing I would say is that any organisation that is either thinking about or is implementing a wellness program is 100% doing something right.
Yeah.
So that's a big tick in the box from me, number one. But I think if we're going to talk about pitfalls and things potentially that people might want to look out for, I think the number one thing is that people tend to look at wellness more, and I think I touched on this before, around the programs and the policies. And they forget about, the need to create the right culture and the need to think about the drivers of well-being in the workplace. And they lose sight of the fact that those three things are absolutely interlinked. If you have one and you don't have the other two, then you're going to struggle to succeed. So you have to have interventions in all three of those areas. So maybe if I give you a quick example.
Great.
In an organisation, for example, you may have a fantastic policy on paternity leave where you have an enhanced amount of leave available to people. But you find that no one's actually taking that and you can't understand why, because it's such a great policy.
Yes.
But if you don't have the right culture in your organisation, for example, where you've got a senior leader who recently had a child but didn't themselves take that leave, so hasn't modelled that behaviour, people are not talking about it in the workplace. So then people start to think, well, maybe it's not okay to take that leave. Or you're in an organisation where you're not giving proper feedback. People don't understand what their career path is or what their next step might be. There may be a perception that, hold on, if I suddenly take all this leave, what does that mean for my promotion? Because I don't know, I haven't had those conversations. So you have to make sure that you're supporting everything that you do in each of those three areas. So I think that's one of the biggest pitfalls. I think the other thing to be really mindful of is the importance of creating the right culture. And I think this is going to be the biggest, thing for people to kind of get over, particularly I think in Asia, where I think mental health is not talked about particularly openly. And I think you'd even find that a lot of companies probably have healthcare policies that don't cover mental illness. That would be a starting point. But I think, creating that culture is going to be really, really difficult. So, anything else that you try to do is going to be hard if you haven't got a culture where people are allowed to talk about these things, where it's normalized. It will always be stigmatized.
Okay. Sounds like there's a few examples there then.
I can probably think of a few, but there's definitely work to be done, yes.
Absolutely. So Joey, we couldn't really talk about wellness without addressing COVID and the new norm in which we live. So based on the current working culture experiences that we're going through at the moment, do you think COVID has been a catalyst for good? And what are the long-term ramifications, do you think, of COVID and the sort of new outlook towards wellness as a principle, do you think?
Okay, do I think COVID's been a catalyst for good? Well, when it comes to well-being, yes. I think what COVID has done is bring well-being into the kind of fore. So it's something that's now being talked about. Organisations are interested in it. People are concerned about it. There are interventions happening. My concern, though, is that maybe it's a little bit of a fad and maybe it's something that organisations think they only have to address now in this COVID situation, and that once we've kind of passed that, or we're all kind of accustomed to the way of working, that we don't need to worry about it anymore. So that would be my concern, or that we get a little bit fatigued and we get a little bit sick of talking about it. But I think if this is just a starting point for organisations to really start thinking about building wellbeing programs, then fantastic. It is one good thing that has come out of the entire kind of like COVID situation for workplaces and for individuals.
Yeah, okay. And obviously we're in quite trying economic times at the moment, obviously different for different countries, etc., in different industries. But for businesses that might be a little bit cash strapped, do you think there's a concern that wellness might be put down the pecking order as a priority? And if so, how can we address that?
Yeah, I think with any organisation, there's obviously a financial and a resource reality, and organisations, regardless of how much they care about employees, have to figure out how they're going to spend their money and how they allocate their resources. So I get that. But I don't think, based on what I've already said about spending money, and you don't have to spend lots of money, I don't think organisations should see that as a barrier to kind of like progressing with their wellness initiatives and with developing wellness plans.
Yeah, okay.
I think some important things to consider, though, if we are going to continue the way that we are now with working from home, or with a kind of hybrid model where some people are working from home and some people are going to the office, I think organisations have done a fantastic job, and so have individuals, in terms of being able to kind of like make that transition so quickly and at scale, number one. So I don't want to kind of like downplay how important that was and what a great job people did. But I think that was kind of done so fast, there wasn't a lot of thought maybe put into how that's going to be manageable longer term. But I think some very simple things, again, if you think about well-being, just have a think about physical environment at home. A lot of people, I imagine, are sitting at their dining tables and making do and everything else. Now, physically, that's not good for someone's physical health. It's not good for your back. It's not good for posture. Organisations need to start thinking about how are they going to make sure people have the right equipment to do their job. Also, when you're at home, like, how often are you moving now during the day? More than likely, you're probably eating lunch at home. You're not, walking to your car, or you're not walking from the parking lot. So again, you need to think about how are individuals getting physical activity.
So it's not necessarily about spend or budget, it's about, again, being creative and putting some thought into how you're communicating things more than anything.
Exactly. And there are other things like around, I think when people started working from home, there was always this perception that working from home meant great work-life balance. It means we can work less hours and we'll have loads of time to go and do other things. I think people found it was the absolute opposite of that. So again, organisations now need to put a lot of thought into, if people are going to continue to work at home, how are we going to make sure that they have that right balance? How are we going to make sure that they're only working certain hours? And again, this goes back to culture and senior leadership. Senior leadership also have to have work-life balance. They can't be sending emails at midnight and then, not expecting their team to do the same thing.
Practice what they preach.
Exactly. So there's that. I think, Sam, one of the other things that organisations really need to consider as well, particularly in a hybrid model where you have some people working from the office and some people working from home, is that there can be this creation of a kind of disparity of opportunity. So those who are going into the office, have a lot more opportunity to speak informally to people, to maybe have face-to-face discussions with their manager about, their performance and about their career, whereas those at home may not have that. So organisations need to be really cognizant of that, and they need to make sure that people who are at home actually have that opportunity too. The other thing about working from home is that you also have to manage around, various noises and things in the background, as we're experiencing here right now. So I think, again, that's something that organisations have to make allowances for as well. And I think the final thing is really the kind of need for connection, which I touched on previously. So individuals, while they're in the workplace, they can informally have that water cooler chat, they can go for lunch with someone. You can't do that at home.
Of course.
So organisations have to think about how do they make sure that people can still make connections and make friends at work. It's super, super important.
Absolutely.
So I think all of those things, there's lots of other things too, but organisations should not think that they can just take the way that they did things and the policies that they had in an office environment
and transplant them onto working from home.
Yes.
You have to think about working from home as a completely kind of like different
paradigm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And think about well-being and how you're going to kind of manage and mitigate some of the concerns, you know, to really kind of like enhance people's well-being.
Absolutely. So Joe, thinking a little bit more about our current setting here in Malaysia, where do you think we are in relation to a culture of wellness adoption here with businesses here in Malaysia? And also, what do you see as the biggest blockers and areas for further attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think there's quite a way to go. I don't think that's necessarily different though than anywhere else in the world. So I would just preface it by saying that up front. But I think one of the biggest concerns that I have is the stigma attached to anything relating to mental health.
Right. Okay.
I've already talked about the fact that insurance generally doesn't cover mental illness, and I think part of that is the fact that it's kind of a bit it's unseen, whereas with a physical illness people can see that there's something, you know, not right, you know, but with mental illness it's not like that. So
of course
it's quite difficult, and I think it's getting people to talk about that and be open about that. That's going to take a lot of time, so like don't expect, you know, that to happen overnight. It's small steps.
And there's probably within the individuals themselves a bit of reticence to talk about it as a cultural piece there, as well as obviously businesses and their policies.
Exactly, and I think one of the things you always have to bear in mind, it's not about just the culture of the organisation, but also the culture, the broader culture and society, and the way people have been brought up, and the things that are deemed to be acceptable and not acceptable. So coming out and talking about mental health or talking about struggles, it is stigmatized, and this is why we really need leadership support. We need leaders who are going to be willing to come forward and not necessarily, you know, always talk about their own personal stories, although that is super helpful, but to talk about wellness, to talk about the importance of it, to talk about what good looks like, and to encourage people to feel safe in speaking up about these things.
And your observation in Malaysia, based on, you know, what you've seen, is businesses can and should do more to make people feel comfortable about coming forward with those types of points, would you say? About their well-being, about their mental health, how if they're feeling particularly low, that's something that they should feel comfortable coming forwards and talking about.
I think that they should, and this is why I kind of said earlier, you know, it would be great within organisations to have some kind of training of people within the organisation to be able to actually recognise the signs of what is good health, and you know, to be able to recognise when someone's health is maybe deteriorating a little bit, and to know what to do about that. Again, I'll reiterate, I'm not saying people should be, you know, trained and as kind of like medical health professionals, but they know where to go and they know how to raise these points.
Absolutely.
So I think that's probably the biggest gap. And again, this is no different than anywhere else. In other parts of the world, there is more talk about mental health now. It's a little bit in vogue, I feel, in certain countries. And hopefully, you know, it will go further and it will become normalised.
Yes.
I think the other thing I would say in Malaysia is organisations should really look at a lot of the things that they're already doing. So I've said already that, you know, when it comes to organisational kind of like drivers of well-being, organisations are probably already doing a lot of stuff around making sure people have feedback, making sure that they're communicating properly. They're just not calling it well-being. So just have a think about those things and think about how, you know, the things that the interventions that you're already doing in those areas, how they can affect well-being, and maybe how you can fine-tune them. And maybe just how you can kind of like target them more. So don't think that you're not doing anything and you have to start from nothing. It's just about joining up within the three areas, the interventions that are already happening, and joining them up together and make sure that they're a little bit more seamless and that you have an overall program.
Okay. Well, that's great advice. And actually, Joe, that brings us to the end of the Insight on Demand session today. So thank you ever so much for joining us.
No problem.
And sharing those insights on the growing important topic of wellness. So thank you.
Thank you, Sam.